I want to welcome you all to this wonderful presentation. My name is Rumba Wilson, and I'm here to present the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the church organizations that is part of the Church of God that has moved from Eden, and it is going to heaven. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a church which is part of the Church of God, because the Church of God has moved from Eden and is going to heaven, to Eden, and the Church of God has moved in different stages. So the stages of the Church of God, that is where we also find, that's where we fix in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So now, before we come up, we talk about the details about the coming up or the birth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We need first to understand where the Church of God has moved, or how the Church of God has moved from the day of creation up to this time, and also where it is going. So the first thing that we're going to look at, the church in its ages. So the first church that existed is the church of the Old Testament. The church of the Old Testament existed between the creation of the earth up to the birth of Jesus Christ, or up to the time of the life of Jesus Christ. Now, sometimes maybe we may ask, how can you know that this is the Church of God? The Church of God has three characteristics. The three characteristics that makes up the Church of God. And these three characteristics and these three principles, the Church of God has moved from the time of creation up to this time. So the first principle, like what Christ said himself. Christ said himself in John chapter 15 verse 10, that if you love me, keep my commandments, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So the first thing that always, the first principle that the Church of God always uses is the principle of obedience to the law of God, because Christ was obedient to the law of his Father. So even the Church of God, one is the church that upholds the law of God. And then the Church of God is the church that believes in the salvation through the life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the Church of God is the church that preaches, or that presents about the second coming of Jesus Christ. So there are three things that the Church of God always preaches. Preaches about obedience to the law of God, talks about life through our life, or our redemption through the life of Jesus Christ, and death, and also his resurrection. So the first church, that is the church of the Old Testament, that is the message that the church was preaching. During the church of the Old Testament, the people from the time of Adam, even up to the time of the Israelites, they were all preaching about being obedient to the law of God. They were also preaching about the second coming of Jesus Christ, and they used to make the symbols of sacrifices, or they use the symbols of forgiveness through the killing of the lambs. And that lamb, they even understood that lamb was signifying the death of Jesus Christ who is about to come. And they also believed in the first and second coming of Jesus Christ. So that was the principle of the Church of God. So the Church of God in the first era that existed from the time of Adam up to the time of Jesus. That is the church of the Old Testament. And then from the church of the Old Testament, we come to the church of the New Testament. The church of the New Testament started from the time Christ started his ministry. When Christ started his ministry of preaching, that is when the church of the New Testament also started. And it moved from the time Christ started preaching, the time he organized the disciples, the time he went to heaven, he left the church of the New Testament. The disciples, the time of the life of the disciples, that was the time of the New Testament, up to 538 AD. That is 538 AD. That is when the church of the New Testament ended. And from the church of the New Testament, from 538 AD, then we came to the church of the Dark Ages. The church of the Dark Ages, the reason why it was called the church of the Dark Ages is because during this period, the period of 1,260 years of persecution, Christians were persecuted. People who obeyed God. People used to preach the second coming. People used to preach life through Christ were persecuted. So the persecution that was prophesied in Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, where Daniel saw in a vision that the time is going to come when the beast will be given to him the saints of the Most High, and is going to persecute the saints of the Most High for a time, times, and the dividing of time that times and the dividing of times representing 3.5 years. And 3.5 years, if you take it to days, it is 1,260 days or 60 years. So that persecution. So the church of the Dark Ages, the church that existed during the time of the persecution. So the time of persecution was from 538 AD to 1798. That was the period of the church of the Dark Ages. That is the time when the Christians who obeyed God were persecuted. And then within that period of the Dark Ages, there also came up another church within the period of Dark Ages. That is the Church of the Reformation. So the Church of the Reformation consisted of the team of groups, or the team of members or believers who opposed what the teaching of the Roman Empire, and then they started coming up with the understanding of the Bible. So and also they started interpreting the Bible in other languages apart from the original tongue, that is the Greek and the Latin. So from there, people who existed during the time of the Church of the Reformation, that is where we find the people like William Tyndale, the people like John Huss, people like Jerome, people like John Wycliffe, and also people like the Martin Luther. So this group of believers, these are the people who worked very hard to make sure that our Bible that we are using today is being interpreted in other languages apart from the original language. So that was the period of the Reformation. And during this time, it was in 1500s, in 1500s. That is the time when there is this generation or era which is called the Church of the Reformation. Now, from after the Church of the Reformation, after people have been reformed from the Roman Catholic Church, and then there came also another team, another generation of the Church of God. That is the Church of the Pilgrim Fathers. The Church of the Pilgrim Fathers, because of the persecution that was going on in Europe, people decided to move from Europe, and then they decided to go somewhere. And as they were moving somewhere, they were going somewhere using a ship. They discovered a new place, and that place that they discovered was America, the United States. That was in 1620. And then when that place was discovered, people started worshiping. They came up with a new system of worship. So the people who moved from Europe because of the fear of the persecution, who discovered America, that group of people were the people who were called the Pilgrim Fathers. That was during the time of the years of the 600 in 1600 years. So, or in 1600 and also 1700. That is when we had that period of the Pilgrim Fathers, and also meaning the Church of the Reformation and also the Church of the Pilgrim Fathers existed within the Church of the Dark Ages. And then the Church of the Dark Ages came to an end in 1798. 1798, that is the Church of the Dark Ages. That is when it came to an end. And then immediately when the Church of the Dark Ages ended in 1798, another church came up. That is the Church of the first missionary. So now, because people have been reformed and the persecution has come to an end, and then people started preaching the gospel throughout the world, as it is written, as Christ prophesied, that And this gospel of the kingdom of God shall be preached to all nations as a testimony, and then the end to come. So this is the time when we started now seeing the missionaries started scattering abroad, started preaching the gospel of God. And the first and well-known missionaries who preached the gospel in this period of the church of the missionaries is a missionary like William Carey, Robert Moffat, that is David Livingstone, and also Morrison, and a lot of missionaries. So during this time, during the time of the first missionaries, that is the time when the message was preached. The message went abroad through the missionaries. That was the church that existed from 1798 to 1831. So after 1831, during the church of the missionaries, now also in 1831, another person came up who is called William Miller, came up with the theory of Adventism, the theory of teaching about the second coming of Jesus. So in 1831, the Church of the Adventists was born. The Church of the Adventists. The Church of the Adventists was born by the leadership of William Miller. William Miller came up with a group, and then he started teaching people about the second coming of Christ, basing on the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, which says, until 2300 days then shall the sanction be cleansed. He started preaching about the second coming, that Christ is going to come. So that is during the church of the Adventists from 1831 to 1844. 1831 to 1844. And then in 1844, that is where now we saw the birth of the last church, which is the Church of the Remnant. The Church of the Remnant. The Church of the Remnant, which was born in 1844, is the church that was prophesied, that was seen by John in Revelation chapter 12 verse 17, where it says, and the dragon was wrath with the woman, and he went to make wars with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandment of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So this is the church, and the church of the remnant, according to the prophecy, is the last church. There is no other church apart from the church of the remnant. So the church of the remnant was born in 1844, immediately after the end of the Church of the Adventists, the Church of the Adventists. So the Church of the Remnant is the church which started in 1844 up to this time, and it's the church that Christ is going to find. That is the Church of the Remnant. So in short, the Church of God has moved from Eden, and it is even now, and it is going to heaven. And the last church that will go up to the time of the end is the Church of the Remnant, which is the last church, which is the 80th church. So meaning we have talked about 8 churches. 8 churches. That is the church of the Old Testament, the church of the New Testament, the church of the Dark Ages, the church of the Reformation, the church of the first missionaries, or the Pilgrim Fathers, and then the church of the first missionaries, the church of the Adventists, and then the church of the remnant. So that is the stages where the church of God has moved. So now, it is now within that church of the remnant, that is where the church, which is now called the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was born. So we are now going to talk about how the Seventh-day Adventist was born within the last church, the 80th church, which is called the Church of the Remnant. Thank you so much. Watch and see how the Seventh-day Adventist was born. So we are going to use a chronological order of years. We are going to begin with the 538 so that we know the background of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, how it came about. So in 538, according to how we looked at, we said that in 538, that was the beginning of the 1260 years. The 1260 years of persecution started in 538 AD. And then from 538 AD, we come to 1755. 1755, that is when we saw the first sign that was prophesied by Jesus, that before his coming, there will be the great earthquake. And then the greatest earthquake that the world has ever seen took place in 1755. And that earthquake is called the Lisbon earthquake. So the Lisbon earthquake was one of the greatest earthquakes. And so far, there has never been the earthquake that has covered the biggest line of the northern part of the world. It started from the northern part of America, and then through Europe, and then it went down to Australia. So that was the greatest earthquake, which is called the Lisbon earthquake, which took place in 1755. From 1755, 25 years later, another sign that just talked about, that is the sun to be darkened. The sun to be darkened, there was what is called the dark day. The dark day was on 19th May 1780. 19th May 1780, that is when there was a dark day. From a dark day, 2 years after the dark day, a person, one of the famous person who introduced the concept of the Advent movement, who first preached the second coming of Jesus Christ under the Church of the Adventists, which is William Miller. William Miller was born in 1782. 1782, William Miller was born. And then after 1782, we come to 1798. 1798, that was the end of the 1260 years of persecution. The people of God were persecuted according to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, and also Revelation chapter 12. It talks about the persecution of the saints for 1260 years or days, which is years in prophecy. And then from 1798, after the fulfillment of, after the end of the Dark Ages, then we come to 1821. 1821, or maybe we come to 1816. 1816, this is when William Miller, the founder of the promoter of the second coming of Jesus Christ, that is when he started studying the Word of God, especially Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, which says, until 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So William Miller started studying that prophecy, and then he started making the calculations concerning the fulfillment of that prophecy. And then he started studying that prophecy in 1816. That is when he started studying that prophecy. And then from 1816, after William Miller started studying the prophecy, then we come to 1821. 1821, that was the birth of James White. The birth of James White, the husband to Ellen G. White. And then after James White was born in 1821, we come to 1826. 1826, that was the birth of Ellen G. White. Ellen God Hammond. Before he got married to Ellen G. White, before she got married to Ellen G. White, she was called Ellen God Hammond. She was born in 1826. And then from 1826, we come to 1831. 1831, that is when we saw now this William Miller, after studying the prophecy of 2,300 years of Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, when he started studying it in 1816, and then from 1816 up to 1831, that is when now he concluded and he was convinced that what he was studying was the correct thing, and he made the projections that according to his understanding, the coming of Jesus Christ is going to happen in 1844. So he started preaching. So that was the birth of the Church of the Adventists. So the Church of the Adventists was born in 1831, immediately when William Miller started preaching the second coming of Jesus Christ. So that was in 1831. That's when William Miller started preaching the second coming of Jesus Christ. And then from 1831 we come to 1840. 1840, after William Miller has organized the group, the biggest group of believers, the biggest group of preachers who helped him preaching the second coming of Jesus Christ in America. Then there was a man or a fellow believer of William Miller who was called Joshua V. Himes. Joshua V. Himes started publishing a book which was called The Signs of the Times. The Signs of the Times. So The Signs of the Times was first published by Joshua V. Himes in 1840. That was the book that they used to use in their evangelism concerning the second coming of Jesus Christ. And then from 1840 we come to 1844. 1844, we said that 1844 is the end of the Church of the Adventists. Why? The reason why the Church of the Adventists came to an end is because of the understanding of the Adventists, the way William Miller understood the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, verse 25. For him, he thought the cleansing of the sanctuary, according to the Bible, meant that Christ is going to come from heaven to the earth. So because of that, he misunderstood the whole thing of prophecy. Instead of Christ to come back on this earth, the real prophecy meant that Christ to move from the holy of holies, the holy place, to the holy of holies. So it was not about Christ coming on earth, but it was about Christ moving from the holy place to the holy of holies, so that the investigative judgment can begin. So that misunderstanding, that misconception that William Miller had led to the greatest disappointment, because he preached that Christ is going to come in 1844, and he even set up the specific dates that on the 22nd October 1844 Christ was supposed to come, and he was very much convinced that Christ is going to come according to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14. Unfortunately, during that time, on October 22nd October 1844, Christ did not come. And because of the disappointment that people had, because a lot of people sold what they had, a lot of people invested money in evangelism, having the feeling that Christ is going to come. And then because of that disappointment, then everyone started crying. And in that midnight, there was what is called, it was called now the midnight cry. People started crying because of the losses that they made. Now the goodness is, the same time on 22nd October 1844, when people were crying, before the people they started crying, when they were waiting for the second coming of Jesus, there was a woman who also accepted the message of Adventism. That woman was congregating to a church which was called the Seventh-day Baptist. So according to the Adventists, this madam, the so-called Mrs. Rachel O'Keefe, this Mrs. Rachel O'Keefe was the only Adventist who understood the concept of the Sabbath, because she was congregating to the church which was called the Seventh-day Baptist. So now, during the time they were waiting for for Jesus to come on 22nd October 1844, this woman started preaching about the Sabbath and started explaining how God has talked about the Sabbath. And then he gave detailed information. He gave detailed verses that talks about the Sabbath, and a lot of verses that talks about the Sabbath. And then a lot of people there listened, and almost 40 people amongst the Adventists accepted the Sabbath truth that was preached by Madame O'Keefe, by Rachel O'Keefe. And then after the disappointment, people were disappointed. And then they say, now, what else are we going to do? And then that team of 40 people who accepted the Sabbath truth, they said, no, we cannot just be quiet. Since we have understood, we have known these two concepts. We have known the concept of the second coming of Jesus Christ, and we have also known the concept of the Sabbath truth. So we are going to begin preaching the second coming of Jesus Christ, including the Sabbath. And then that team of 40 people came together, and they made a group, they made a congregation, and that congregation was made in a town called New Hampshire. So at New Hampshire, that is where they created the first Adventist church. So the first Adventist church for the whole Adventist world was at New Hampshire SDA Church. So meaning the mother church for all the Seventh-day Adventist church in the world is called New Hampshire SDA Church in America. So that was the church where the first 40 people, or the first 40 Adventists who accepted the Adventist message, and also they accepted the Sabbath truth, and then they came up with a church. That time they did not even register that church, but they started just worshiping, bringing ideas together so that they can know how they can register the church. Now, even before they even registered the church, they used to call it as Seventh-day Adventist Church, because according to them, they understood that the only message that they had at that time was the message of the second coming of Jesus Christ, and also the message of the Sabbath truth, meaning the teaching about the full law of God. That was what happened in 1844. Now the reality, what also happened in 1844. So the first church, the first Seventh-day Adventist church was established in 1844 at New Hampshire SDA Church by only 40 believers. And then from during the same time, 1844, in reality, the meaning of that prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, the cleansing of the sanctuary, was Jesus to move from the holy place to the Holy of Holies, so that the investigative judgment should begin. So the investigative judgment, according to Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 and 7, which says that fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of judgment has come. So the hour of judgment came on 22nd October 1844. So because that was the year and the day that Christ entered the Holy of Holies, so that it begins the high priest work. That is the investigative judgment. So that was the whole thing about 1844. So that was the year that the Seventh-day Adventist was born. But that was not the year it was registered, but it was just to be born. And then from 1844, we go to 1846. 1846, that is where we see Ellen G. White and James White got married. Ellen G. White and James White got married in 1846. From 1846, we go to 1849. 1849, that is when we saw the founder or the preacher of the second coming of Jesus, that is the Adventist movement, William Miller. That was the year he died. Yeah, and unfortunately, he died as a blind man. So in 1849, this veteran, the so-called William Miller, who preached the second coming of Jesus Christ, or who brought the concept of Adventism, died in 1849. And in the same year, 1849, that is when also the group of the Seventh-day Adventist members, that 40 people, now at that time now they have grown. That group, they published the first book that they started using in evangelism, and that book was called The Present Truth. So The Present Truth was published in 1849, and 2 years later, another book was published by James White, the husband to Ellen G. White. That book in 1852, that was the book called The Youth Instructor. That book was, he wrote that book specifically for the guidance of the youths in the church, and it was given under the Sabbath School department. So from 1852, we go to 1860. Now in 1860, now the group of believers, the leaders of the churches, they thought of, at least they thought of registering a church officially. And in 1860, that is when they officially registered the name. They registered the name of the church as Seventh-day Adventist Church. So from 1860, that is when the church was officially called the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it was registered as a worldwide church in 1860. When the churches were registered, 3 years later, the churches started growing. The membership started growing, and the number of churches started growing. In 1863, the leaders of the church, they thought of creating a system that can be helping them to control the leadership and the spiritual life of the churches. And then they thought of creating what is called the General Conference. So the General Conference office was created in 1863. So 1863, after creating the General Conference office, they elected a person they used to call the President of the General Conference. And that President of the General Conference was called John Byington. John Byington was the first President of the General Conference. That was in 1863. And also the Secretary of the General Conference in 1863 was Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith was the first Secretary of the General Conference. And then from 1863, we go to 1876. In 1876, the Adventist Church, they also thought again of creating, of publishing a book again, the book that was published by the Adventists. Now they also published again a book called The Signs of the Times. The Signs of the Times was now published officially by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1876. 3 years later, after publishing that book, Signs of the Time, there was a church. There was a church called Heston SDA Church. At Heston SDA Church, there were 2 young men, 2 boys. One boy, the first one was Luther Warren, and the other one was Harry Fenner. Luther Warren was 14 years old, and then Harry Fenner was 17 years old. So Harry Fenner, who was 17 years old, and also Luther Warren was 14 years old. These 2 people, they came up with the idea of creating an organization within the church that can help them develop the spiritual life of young people. And they brought that issue to the church board, and the church board at Heston SDA Church, they accepted the ideas of these young boys. And from there, they introduced an organization called the Young People's Society of Missionary Volunteers, called the MV in short, MV. So that movement, that department was born. The department which is now called the Adventist Youth Ministries Department. The department which has the rights to have this uniform that I'm wearing, because this uniform that I'm wearing is the uniform that is under the Adventist Youth Ministries. So this department called the Adventist Youth Ministries was first introduced by 2 young men, 2 young boys in 1879. From 1879 we go to 1881. In 1881 we saw another man who worked very hard in evangelism. That is King George. King George was the first colporteur, the first literature evangelist who worked very hard to an extent that the church even reached an extent of creating a department in the church because of his influence in Kaupota ministries. In 1881, because of the influence of King George, the church introduced a department called publishing department officially in the church. And then in the same year, 1881, that is when the husband to Ellen G. White, the prophetess, who worked very hard, who wrote a lot of books which we call the Spirit of Prophecy. The husband, James White, died in 1881. From 1881, we go to 1887. 1887, that is when we saw the message of the Seventh Adventist reached Africa through the Cape Town by D.A. Robinson. D.A. Robinson was a pioneer who was sent by the General Conference to come and open the Adventist Church in Africa, specifically South Africa. That was in 1887. We move to 1894. In 1894, Luther Warren, the founder of the Adventist movement, which is called the MV, also within the Missionary Volunteers Society, he introduced a program or a band which is called the Sunshine Band, which we now call as the Singing Band. So the Singing Band or the Sunshine Band in Adventist Youth Ministries was introduced in 1894. From 1894, we go to 1903. 1903, that is when the Seventh Adventists moved the headquarters from Battle Creek to Washington, D.C. From Battle Creek to Washington, D.C. because the offices at Battle Creek was burnt to ashes. So they thought of moving the headquarters from Battle Creek to Washington, D.C. And that burning of the headquarters in Battle Creek was prophesied by Ellen G. White that this headquarters is going to be burned and it is supposed to be moved from this place. So the movement of the headquarters from Battle Creek to Washington, D.C. was in 1903. In 1905, that is when the message of Seventh-day Adventist Church reached Zambia. Zambia as a country received the message of the Seventh Adventist Church in 1903 by W.H. Anderson. W.H. Anderson brought Adventist message in Zambia. There specifically at Pemba Mission, which is now commonly known as Lusangu Mission. That was in 1905. In 1907, that is where we see the General Conference now reached an extent of accepting now the Young People's Society Department of Missionary Volunteer now to be officially as a worldwide organization for the youths. And it was adopted in 1907. And the General Conference elected M.E. Kane as the worldwide Missionary Volunteer Department Director. That was in 1907. And from there, in 1907, we moved to 1915. 1915, that is where we see the death of Ellen G. White, our prophetess, who has written all the books that are known as the Spirit of Prophecy. The Spirit of Prophecy was written by Ellen G. White, and that Ellen G. White, who worked very hard for the organization of the Seventh Adventist Church, died in 1915. After the death of Ellen G. White, in 1917, the message reached Musofu. Musofu Mission was opened in Zambia. Musofu Mission is between Kapili and Mukushi. that jungle between Kapili and Ndola, Ndola and Mukushi. If you go through the road which is called the Nkumbi High College, that is where we are going to find Musofu Mission. That Musofu Mission was opened in 1917. From there, from 1917, we go to 1921. 1921, that is where we saw another mission was opened. That is the Chimpempe Mission. Chimpempe Mission was opened in 1921. 1921. That is Chimpempe Mission. That is under the Wapula Zambia Conference. Chimpempe Mission was opened in 1921. In 1922, we saw also the General Conference introduced now the classwork lessons, for juniors, for junior missionary volunteers, and they also introduced 3 classes for junior missionary volunteers. That is the classes that were introduced were friend, companion, and comrade. The comrade class is the class which is now known as guide class, and then from there, and for the leaders of these young ones, they also introduced another leadership class which was called the master comrade. So the introduction of the classwork and also the introduction of the 3 classes in the junior missionary volunteer was introduced in 1922. From 1922 we go to 1925. 1925, that is when the Mwami mission was officially, Mwami mission station was officially opened. Mwami mission was officially opened, and 2 years later, after they opened a station, they now opened what is called the Mwami Mission Hospital. Mwami Mission Hospital was opened in 1927. That is when they opened the Mwami Mission Hospital. From 1927, we go to 1932. 1932, that is where we see the General Conference first created what is called the church manual. The church manual, that is the book that we use as a church for all the guidance of the church, which is called the church manual. So church manual was first published in 1932. That is when they published the first edition, because the edition that they have published this year, 2023, it's the 20th edition. Now in 1932, they published the first edition of the church manual. From 1932, we go to 1946. From 1946, that is where we see John Hancock. John Hancock designed the Pathfinder Triangle. The Pathfinder Triangle was designed by John Hancock. And then in 1947, another person by the name of Henry Berg also composed what is called the Pathfinder song. The Pathfinder song was composed. And then also in 1948, we saw also the Pathfinder flag was designed by Hobbies. Hobbies designed the Pathfinder flag in 1948. 1948, he designed the Pathfinder flag. Now, because of these 3 things were done for the Pathfinder Club, that is the Pathfinder emblem, the Pathfinder song was composed, and also the Pathfinder flag. Then in 1950, the church thought of adopting now officially the Pathfinder Club as a worldwide club for juniors aged 10 to 15 years. So Pathfinder Club was officially adopted at the General Conference as a worldwide organization in 1950, and the General Conference elected Lawrence Skinner as the first Pathfinder Youth Director. And in the same year, in 1950, that is when they had even the first Pathfinder Fair. The first Pathfinder Fair in California was in 1950. From there, from 1950, we moved to 1978. 1978, that is where we see the change, or maybe you can say 1951. 1951, that is where we see the change of the title from missionary volunteer, from master comrade to master guide. Master comrade to master guide was changed in 1951. And then from 1951, we go to 1978. 1978, that is where we now saw the change of the name from the Young People's Department of Missionary Volunteers to Adventist Youth, which is the AY. So the department was called AY Department from 1978. From 1978, we come to 1989. 1989, that is when they introduced, also at the General Conference, they officially adopted a club for juniors, for the first juniors of the Adventist youth, who are called the Adventurer Club. So the Adventurer Club was officially adopted by the General Conference in 1989. So meaning this 2023, we were celebrating the 34th anniversary of the Adventurer Club. So the Adventure Club was adopted by the General Conference in 1989. From 1989, maybe we go to 1995. In 1995, that is when we saw the first black man to be elected as the first black youth director of the General Conference. That is Barack Muganda. Barack Muganda was the first black or the first African to hold the General Conference position as a director in 1995. And then from there, I think now we can just come up with the current affairs. Maybe we can talk about now. That is how the Church of God has moved. This is how the Seventh-day Adventist Church has fused in the remnant church, the last part of the church. Now maybe you can just talk about the top leaders. The top leaders, our current, the current top leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I think we are going to begin with the General Conference. The General Conference President. The General Conference President now 2023 General Conference President is Ted Wilson. Ted Wilson, the General Conference President, and then the Youth Director for the General Conference is Busi Kumalo. Busi Kumalo is the General Conference Youth Director. We come to our division, that is the SID, the Southern Africa Indian Ocean Division. The president is Harrington Akombo. Harrington Akombo from Zambia is the president of the Southern Africa Indian Ocean Division, the so-called SID. And then the youth director at the Southern Africa Indian Ocean Division, that is the SID, youth director is Hyvin Gwadringa. Hyvin Gwadringa is the youth director at SID. And then we come to our union. Our union, the North Zambia Union Conference. The North Zambia Union Conference president. The president is Tommy Namitondo. Tommy Namitondo is the president for North Zambia Union North Zambia Union Conference. And then the youth director for North Zambia Union Conference is Pastor Angel Chipuru. Pastor Angel Chipuru is the director for the youths at North Zambia Union Conference. And then we come to Luapula Zambia Conference. Luapula Zambia Conference, The president of the Corporate Assembly Conference in 2023, this year, is Pastor Teddy Kaunda. Pastor Teddy Kaunda is the president of the Corporate Assembly Conference. And then when you come to the youth director for the Corporate Assembly Conference is Pastor Christopher Chambula. Pastor Christopher Chambula is the youth director for the Corporate Assembly Conference. So this is all about the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, from where it started, from Eden, how it was fused in the Church of God, and where it is now. So this is the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Thank you so much for watching. May God bless you as you continue watching our presentation. Please, I am begging you that may you continue subscribing to my channel so that every presentation that I'm going to be presenting to you, I'm going to be uploading, you are going to be notified. Please, thank you so much. May God bless you. I love you.